One of the accusations that's launched against Christianity or organized religion or Catholicism these days is that it's a kind of wish-fulfilling fantasy. It's a kind of psychological crutch. Of course, the roots of that go way back to Sigmund Freud himself, the great psychologist, who saw that we have these psychological deficiencies. His theory was that we use religion as a way of fulfilling our deepest wishes. So it's just this kind of psychological crutch. Where did he get that from? Well, he got it really from, believe it or not, Karl Marx, who saw that we have these economic needs, and when there's economic poverty, etc., that religion can become a way of just coping with that and helping us get through it. What did Marx famously call religion but the opium of the masses? I don't know how much people these days think that explicitly, but I think there's a kind of vague sense of that in a lot of people. And if you were at Mass recently, you heard readings from the book of Job. And if you paid attention to him, you know that whatever Catholicism is, it just can't be what Marx and Freud thought it was. So let's take a look at that. Now, for my money, Job is one of the most paradigmatic biblical figures, meaning he stands for the human situation. It's one of the oldest texts we have. It's in the Old Testament. The story is Job is a guy who's doing very well, and basically he loses everything. He's lost his wife, he's lost his kids, his own physical health has been destroyed. Now listen to Job's ability to simply reckon with his misery. He says, "Is not man's life on earth a drudgery? Are not his days those of a hireling? He's a slave who longs for the shade, a hireling who waits for his wages." So what's he saying there? But it's the experience of, I don't control my life. I'm totally at the mercy of people around me. I'm like a slave. He says, "I have been assigned months of misery, and troubled nights have been told off for me." In other words, he's aware that somehow there's a divine plan that somehow encompasses even his misery, these long nights in bed. It's a terrible image, isn't it, where you're just lying in bed and you can't sleep and you're racked with anxiety. I think most of us can relate with that. "If in bed I say, 'When shall I arise?' then the night drags on, and I'm filled with restlessness until the dawn." There's the human situation, right? This deep, restless heart. Now, this line was actually omitted from Mass, but I think it's beautiful. He says, "My flesh is clothed with worms and scabs. My skin cracks and festers." His own body is betraying him. He says, "My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle. They come to an end without hope." And here's the final line, everybody, before we say the word of the Lord at Mass. "Remember that my life is like the wind. I shall never see happiness again." Here's what I want you to see about Job. What he's doing here is not running from, not trying to medicate, and not trying to somehow fulfill his wishes. What's he doing? He's rather naming his deepest miseries, his physical miseries, his psychological miseries and pain, his existential angst, finally his deep spiritual suffering that he feels like God has abandoned him. I love Job because in the book of Job, his friends come to him and they tell him all sorts of kind of religious platitudes, and none of it works. Religion doesn't work for Job as a wish-fulfilling fantasy or as an opiate of his own suffering. But finally what happens at the very end, out of this whirlwind, the Lord speaks, and it's the longest speech that God gives in the whole Bible. And it's essentially God saying, "Job, let me ask you a question. Where were you when I created the whole earth? Where were you when I set up the whole plan for the universe?" It's a call to Job to see his life within a much bigger, more mysterious plan, which is inexorably good, but which Job simply is not in a position to understand. What does God not do in that situation? What he doesn't do is try to medicate Job's suffering. He doesn't. He doesn't promise that Job's going to kind of get everything back. Do you see? That's just not what biblical religion is. That's just not how the Bible sees this game. When I was a seminarian, I was doing a summer internship at a hospital. I walked into a room and there were two dead people in the room. Lying dead. It was a mother and a father, and they had a 13-year-old girl, and she was standing there weeping. She had a 10-year-old son, and she came over to me and she said, "Will you go find me a Bible?" She said, "I want to read the book of Job to my brother." I went back to the office and there was a chaplain there, and I said, "I need a Bible. This girl wants to read the book of Job to her brother with her dead parents there. And the chaplain said, oh, she shouldn't read that book. And I thought, au contraire, I can't think of a better book to understand how religion, especially the Christian, Jewish, biblical religion, is going to come to her aid. And she sat there and she read the book of Job to her young brother in the presence of her deceased parents. An opiate of the people, fulfilling her wishes, medicating her pain and her sorrow. Anything but. If anything's going on there, what she was doing is what Job's doing. It's, in fact, opening up and remaining with our deepest needs and poverties, which can cause us great pain, but standing there in a radical stance of faith, openness to God, in a sense saying, your will be done. I trust you. Be with me. Don't necessarily comfort me. Don't take away my pain, but comfort me and be with me. Now, if you want to go to the end of the Bible, look at Christ on the cross, right? There's a happy, holy man. He's the Son of God too. And yet, he doesn't ask God to take away his sufferings, but rather relates to God the Father all of his sufferings on our behalf. There's the full expression of Job. Jesus fulfilling who Job is with this radical act of trust in God, that God's plan for the whole human race is one of glory and goodness. And when we surrender to that in suffering, we experience not an opiate, not some kind of psychological drug, but we experience faith. Faith in the midst of a life that's filled with suffering. So pick up the book of Job and let it shore up your conviction that the game that the biblical world is playing, that the church is playing, is much different from the game that people like Freud and Marx thought it was.